Hey guys, welcome back to Sleep into Power. I'm NJ. Get comfortable. Lower the lights if they aren't low already. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, and let the day you have just finished begin to move quietly behind you, the way a landscape moves behind a train window. Tonight we are going somewhere very old and very strange, and you don't need to do anything at all to get there except listen. I want you to imagine a night thousands of years ago. There are no electric lights anywhere on Earth. No street lamps, no headlights, no glowing screens, no orange haze sitting over a distant city. When the sun goes down, the world genuinely goes dark, and it stays dark until morning. A person standing on a hillside in the ancient Near East would have known a kind of blackness that most of us alive today have never experienced, and above that blackness, uninterrupted, undimmed, unexplained, the entire sky. Not a few dozen stars scattered thinly across a bruised city sky. Thousands of them. The great pale river of the Milky Way, running from one horizon to the other like spilled milk, like a road, like the seam where two enormous pieces of something have been sewn together. Planets moving slowly against the fixed patterns, night after night, year after year, obeying rules nobody could yet explain. Meteors opening and closing in an instant. There were no telescopes, no understanding of galaxies, of light years, of the physics of burning hydrogen. There was simply a ceiling of light above a dark and frightening world, and a human being standing underneath it with an imagination. And so people did what people have always done. They looked up, and they told stories about what might be living up there. Almost every ancient culture arrived at some version of the same idea, that the sky was not empty, that above the ordinary world of grain and goats and rivers and war, there was another realm, ordered and radiant, inhabited by beings of enormous power, gods, spirits, messengers, servants of a divine court, beings who watched, who carried decisions downward, who moved between one world and the other. Most of those stories were reassuring in some way. The heavens were higher, purer, better governed. Whatever chaos happened down here, up there the order held. But inside that comforting picture, in one particular corner of the ancient world, something disturbing appeared. Some of those heavenly beings, the stories said, had come down. Not because they were sent, not because they were carrying a message, not because a god had commanded it. They came down because they wanted something that was here. That single idea, small at first, buried in a handful of ancient sentences, would eventually grow into one of the most persistent and haunting mythologies in human history. Some traditions would describe angels who rebelled against God and were cast out of heaven. Others would describe heavenly beings called the Watchers, who descended to a mountain, swore an oath together, took human wives, and taught humanity knowledge that humanity was never meant to have. And the strangest part of it is how little the earliest texts actually say, and how enormously the story grew anyway. So tonight, slowly, and with no hurry at all, I want to ask a few questions with you. Who were the fallen angels? Where did the idea actually come from? And how much of what we think we know about them is genuinely ancient? And how much was invented centuries later? Why did they fall? What exactly were they supposed to have taught us? And why did ancient writers look at knowledge itself, at metalworking and astronomy and medicine and writing, and decide that it was dangerous enough to bring the destruction of the world? Underneath all of that, there is a deeper question, and it is the one I really want to leave you with by the end of tonight. What if the story of the fallen angels was never really about monsters at all? What if it was always about knowledge and rebellion and desire and freedom? And what happens when a being crosses a boundary it was never supposed to cross? Before we go down into the dark together, just a few quick things, and then I'll leave you alone with the story for a long, long time. The Sleep into Power book is available on Amazon now, in paperback and on Kindle, and the link is in the description if you'd like to take these ideas a little further in your own time. Every episode is also on Spotify, so if you prefer to drift off without a screen anywhere near you, it's all there waiting. If you enjoy the calmer, quieter side of what we do here, the companion channel is Meditate into Power. Guided meditations, relaxing experiences, and a softer landing on the nights when you don't want history and mythology, you just want to rest. And if you'd ever like to support the documentaries, there is a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. It genuinely helps these get made, and there is absolutely no obligation whatsoever. If immersive documentaries about history, philosophy, psychology, consciousness, ancient mysteries and the ideas that shaped humanity are your kind of thing, then subscribing means the next one finds you automatically. And to everyone who has been here from the beginning, who comments, who tells me what they'd like to hear next, who falls asleep to these and comes back the following night, thank you. You know who you are. Wherever you happen to be listening from tonight, whatever time it is where you are, whether it's late evening or the strange quiet hours after midnight, whether you're in a city or somewhere with a sky full of stars, a little closer to the one we are about to talk about, I'm glad you're here. Now let the room go quiet. We are going back to a world where the sky still had a ceiling. Before we can talk about angels falling, we have to talk about what an angel actually was, because the picture most of us carry around in our heads is a very late arrival. Close your eyes and picture an angel. Almost everyone produces the same image. A beautiful human figure, usually pale, usually serene, dressed in white, with a ring of golden light hovering above the head, and two enormous feathered wings folded at the back. It is an image of gentleness. Greeting cards, Christmas ornaments, Renaissance paintings, a guardian standing behind a child crossing a bridge. That image is real in the sense that it genuinely exists in Western art and devotion, and it has comforted a great many people. But it is one interpretation, developed over many centuries, and it has surprisingly little to do with the beings described in the oldest layers of biblical literature. Start with the word itself. In Hebrew, the word we translate as angel is malach. It does not mean a species. It does not describe a body, or a set of wings, or a personality. It means messenger, an envoy, someone sent. The Greek equivalent used in the Septuagint and the New Testament, angelos, carries exactly the same sense. A messenger, which means that in the earliest texts, angel is not so much what a being is, as what a being is doing. It is a job description, a role in a relationship, someone sent from one place to another, carrying words that are not their own. And when these messengers appear in the older narratives of the Hebrew Bible, they very often look like ordinary men. 3 visitors arrive at Abraham's tent in the heat of the day, and he offers them food, and only gradually does the reader understand who they are. 2 of them walk into Sodom and are mistaken for travelers. Jacob wrestles all night with a figure whose identity the text refuses to make simple, and he limps away from it with a new name and a damaged hip. In these stories there are no halos, there is no shining, there is frequently no way of telling, at first glance, that anything unusual is happening at all. The genuinely strange creatures are elsewhere, and they are far less comforting. The cherubim, for example. Not chubby infants with tiny wings, which is a Renaissance invention and a rather charming misunderstanding of an entirely different classical figure. The cherubim of the Hebrew Bible are guardians. They are stationed at the entrance to Eden with a turning sword of flame to prevent anyone going back in. They are hammered in gold on either side of the Ark of the Covenant, wings meeting above the empty space where the divine presence was understood to rest. When Ezekiel sees them in his vision by the river Kebar, they are terrifying composite beings, faces of a human and a lion and an ox and an eagle, wheels within wheels rimmed with eyes, moving in every direction without turning. Scholars have long noted the family resemblance between these figures and the great hybrid guardian creatures of Mesopotamian and Levantine palaces and temples. the winged, human-headed bulls and lions that stood at gateways to intimidate anyone approaching. These are not friendly beings. They are architecture with a pulse. They stand at thresholds and they keep things out. Or the seraphim, who appear in one astonishing scene in Isaiah chapter 6. The prophet sees the divine throne in the temple, the hem of a robe filling the entire building, and above it, beings with 6 wings, 2 to fly, 2 to cover the face, 2 to cover the feet. And they are calling to one another continually. The word seraph literally means burning one, and elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, the same root is used for the fiery serpents of the wilderness. Fiery, serpentine, 6-winged, endlessly singing, so overwhelming to look at that the prophet's immediate reaction is not joy, but a conviction that he is about to die. Then there is the heavenly host, tsava, an army, a military term. The stars themselves were sometimes counted among this host, which is a detail worth holding on to, because it will matter enormously later on. The heavens were understood as a court and as an army at the same time, an ordered assembly of powerful beings, arranged beneath a throne. And in several passages the Hebrew Bible gives us something even more surprising: a council. In Psalm 82, God stands in the divine assembly and passes judgment among what the text calls Elohim, gods, or divine beings, accusing them of ruling unjustly, of showing partiality to the wicked, and sentencing them to die like mortals. In the first chapter of Job, the sons of God present themselves before the Lord, and one of them, called in Hebrew Ha-Satan, the accuser, arrives among them and is questioned about where he has been. In 1 Kings, the prophet Micaiah describes seeing the Lord seated on a throne, with the whole host of heaven standing to the right and to the left, and a discussion taking place about how to persuade a king to go to his death, until one spirit steps forward with a plan. That is not a lone deity in an empty sky. That is a royal court, with courtiers, with debate, with delegated authority, and, most importantly for our story tonight, with the possibility of a courtier behaving badly. Ancient Israelite religion did not develop in isolation. It grew inside a wider world of Canaanite, Mesopotamian, and Egyptian ideas about the divine. And one of the things scholars have learned from the tablets recovered at Ugarit on the Syrian coast, first excavated in the late 1920s, is how familiar the furniture of that divine court would have felt to an ancient audience. A high god, an assembly of lesser divine beings, messengers running between the levels, sons of the god. The imagery in the biblical texts sits inside that shared vocabulary, even while it is being used to say something quite different about who is actually in charge. And there is one more category, and it is the one that this entire documentary rests upon. In the Book of Daniel, in the Aramaic sections, a strange term appears. The king dreams of a great tree, and in the dream, a figure comes down from heaven. The Aramaic word is ear. It is usually translated as watcher, and it is frequently paired with the phrase Holy One. A watcher and a Holy One came down from heaven. Watcher, one who is awake, one who does not sleep. A being whose defining characteristic is observation. It is such a quiet word for what it eventually came to mean. Because somewhere in the centuries around the writing of Daniel, in the extraordinary ferment of Jewish thought that scholars call the Second Temple period, that word attached itself to a story about heavenly beings who were supposed to watch, and who instead came down. So hold the picture in your mind as we go forward. Not the greeting card, something older and stranger and much less tame. A flat earth beneath a solid dome, with waters above it and waters below it. Mountains holding up the sky at the edges. A divine throne room somewhere above the vault, and beneath it, an ordered assembly of powerful beings, arranged in ranks, burning, winged, composite, unsleeping. A hierarchy connecting heaven to earth like a staircase, with messengers moving up and down it, and a boundary, always a boundary, a line drawn between what belongs above and what belongs below. Everything that follows tonight is a story about that line being crossed. Ask most people in the Western world how the trouble started, and you will get a version of the same answer, delivered with total confidence. There was an angel, the most beautiful of them all, the highest, the brightest. His name was Lucifer. He grew proud. He wanted the throne for himself. There was a war in heaven, and a third of the angels followed him, and he lost, and he was thrown down into the dark, and he became Satan, and the fallen angels became the demons, and ever since then he has been working to drag humanity down with him out of spite. It is a magnificent story. It is coherent, dramatic, psychologically satisfying, and it has shaped Western literature, art, and imagination for the better part of 2,000 years. It is also not in the Hebrew Bible. I want to say that carefully, because this is the point where a lot of documentaries about this subject quietly go off the rails. It is not that the story is fabricated out of nothing. It is that the story was assembled, gradually, over many centuries, out of several separate passages that were originally about entirely different things, and the assembly happened long after those passages were written. So let us look at the raw materials. The first is a passage in the 14th chapter of Isaiah, and it is the source of the name Lucifer. The chapter is a taunt song. That is a recognized genre in ancient Near Eastern literature, a poem of mockery composed to celebrate the downfall of an enemy. The text itself tells us exactly who the target is. It introduces the poem as a taunt against the king of Babylon, and the poem imagines the great king arriving in the underworld, where the shades of dead kings rise from their thrones to greet him with something close to laughter. You too have become weak like us. Your pomp has been brought down. Maggots are your bed. And then comes the famous line, "How you have fallen from heaven. Helel ben Shakar. Helel ben Shakar. Shining one, son of the dawn." Or, as it is usually rendered, morning star, son of the morning. The passage goes on to describe this figure, saying in his heart that he will ascend to heaven, that he will raise his throne above the stars of God, that he will sit on the Mount of Assembly in the far reaches of the north, that he will ascend above the tops of the clouds and make himself like the Most High, and instead he is brought down to the pit. Now there is something genuinely mythological happening here, and scholars have argued about it for well over a century. The imagery of a divine being attempting to seize the high throne on the mountain of assembly and being cast down looks very much like it is drawing on an older Canaanite myth. The Ugaritic texts preserve fragments of a story about the god Athtar, associated with the morning star, who ascends to the throne of Baal and finds that he does not fit it and comes back down. The morning star is a natural candidate for a story like this, because Venus rises brilliantly before the dawn, brighter than anything else in the sky, and then, as the sun comes up, it is swallowed by the light of something greater, a star that climbs and then vanishes. So Isaiah is almost certainly using an existing mythological image, but he is using it as a metaphor. The subject of the poem is a human king, whose empire has been humbled, and the whole force of the passage depends on the contrast between the king's grandiose self-image and his very ordinary, very physical corpse. The name Lucifer arrives centuries later, and it arrives through translation. When Jerome produced the Latin Vulgate at the end of the 4th century, he rendered Helel as Lucifer, which in Latin simply means light-bringer, and was the ordinary Latin word for the morning star. It was not a proper name. Latin writers used it as a common noun. It even appears elsewhere in Latin Christian usage as a title of Christ, since the New Testament calls Christ the bright morning star. But English translators in the 16th and 17th centuries, working after more than 1,000 years of Christian interpretation, carried the word over untranslated capitalized it, and a common noun became a personal name for the devil. That is how a Latin word for Venus became the name of the Prince of Darkness. The second raw material is the 28th chapter of Ezekiel, and the pattern is similar. Again, the text tells us who it is about. It is an oracle against the ruler of Tyre, the great Phoenician trading city on the coast, immensely wealthy, immensely proud, built out onto an island. The prophet mocks the ruler for saying, "I am a god, I sit in the seat of the gods, in the heart of the seas," when in fact he is a man and not a god. And then the oracle shifts into a lament, and the imagery becomes extraordinary. "You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom, and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering," and the text lists them: carnelian, topaz, emerald, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, turquoise. "You were an anointed guardian cherub. You were on the holy mountain of God, walking among the stones of fire. You were blameless from the day you were created, until iniquity was found in you. Your heart became proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor, so I cast you to the ground." You can immediately see why later readers looked at that and thought, that is not a Phoenician businessman, that is somebody else. The imagery is drawing on paradise traditions, on royal ideology, on the ancient Near Eastern habit of describing kings in near-divine terms, and possibly on a lost myth about a primeval figure expelled from a divine garden. The precious stones may evoke the vestments of a high priest. The guardian cherub language connects to those threshold creatures we talked about. Scholars genuinely disagree about how much older mythological material sits underneath the oracle. What they broadly agree on is that Ezekiel is applying it to a human ruler, as a way of saying that a city which believed itself untouchable, which had made wealth into a kind of divinity, was about to discover that it was mortal after all. Two passages then, both about the collapse of arrogant human kingdoms, both using older mythological imagery to make that collapse feel cosmic. And here is the thing about ancient reading. Later interpreters were not being stupid or dishonest when they read these passages differently. They were reading in a way that was completely normal in their world, in which scripture was understood to contain layers of meaning, and in which a passage about a king could simultaneously be a passage about the power standing behind the king. Once Jewish and then Christian thinkers had developed a fuller picture of a cosmic adversary, they went back to their older texts and found him there, in the shining one who fell, in the cherub expelled from the garden. Which brings us to the figure everyone expects to be at the center of this, and who is, at the beginning, remarkably marginal. In the oldest Hebrew texts, Ha-Satan is not a name. It is a common noun with a definite article, meaning the adversary, the accuser, the one who obstructs. It is used of human opponents in several passages without any supernatural implication at all. In the Book of Job, the accuser is a member of the heavenly court, one of the sons of God, who arrives with the others and is questioned by God like a subordinate reporting in. His role is essentially prosecutorial. He suggests that Job's piety is self-interested and asks permission to test it, and every single thing he does afterwards is done with explicit divine authorization. He is not in rebellion. He is not in exile. He appears to be doing a job, and it is an unpleasant job, but it is a job within the system. In the vision in Zechariah, the accuser stands at the right hand of the high priest to accuse him, and is rebuked. In 1 Chronicles, a Satan incites David to take a census, which is fascinating because the older parallel account of the same event in 2 Samuel attributes the incitement to God. Scholars have long treated that as a small window onto a shift in thought, an increasing discomfort with attributing troubling actions directly to God, and a corresponding tendency to hand them to an intermediary figure. Somewhere across the Second Temple period, that intermediary hardens into a character. The article drops away. The accuser becomes Satan. By the time we reach the New Testament, we have a genuine adversary with a personality and a kingdom called the devil, the tempter, the ruler of this world, the prince of the power of the air. By the time we reach the book of Revelation, we have a great red dragon, explicitly identified as the ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, whose tail sweeps a third of the stars out of heaven and throws them to the earth, and who is thrown down after a war in heaven led by Michael. So the familiar story does exist. It simply exists at the end of a long process of development, rather than at the beginning. And here is what I find genuinely remarkable, and where this documentary really begins. While all of that was slowly taking shape, there was another story circulating, older in its written form than most of the passages that later became the Lucifer myth. Wildly popular, enormously detailed, and it had nothing to do with pride, or thrones, or a war in heaven. In that story, the heavenly beings did not fall because they wanted to be God. They fell because they looked down at the earth, and they saw women, and they wanted them. I want you to slow down with me here, because we have arrived at one of the strangest things in the entire Hebrew Bible, and almost everyone reads straight past it. Open the book of Genesis. You have had the creation of the world. You have had the garden, and the serpent, and the expulsion. You have had Cain and Abel, and the first city, and the first metalworkers and musicians, and a long genealogy of names, and you are moving towards the flood, which is one of the best-known stories on earth. And then, wedged in between the genealogy and the flood, occupying 4 verses and no more, there is this. When human beings began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves from any they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God went in to the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. That is it. That is the whole thing. And then the text simply moves on, as though nothing peculiar has occurred, into the statement that the wickedness of humanity was great on the earth, and that God regretted having made them, and the flood begins. Read it again slowly in your mind, because the oddity is not in what it says. The oddity is in everything it refuses to say. Who are the sons of God? The Hebrew is Bene Ha-Elohim, and it is the same phrase used in Job for the members of the heavenly court. It is not explained here. It is used as though the audience already knows exactly what it means, the way you might refer to the cabinet or the board, without stopping to define it. What did they do exactly, and why was it wrong? The text uses entirely ordinary marriage language. They saw, they took, they went into them, and children were born. There is no word of condemnation attached to the act. There is no punishment of the sons of God described. There is no explanation of what rule has been broken. Who are the Nephilim? The name appears without introduction, in a sentence whose grammar is so awkward that translators have been arguing about it for centuries. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards. Afterwards? After what? And are the Nephilim the children of these unions, or were they simply also present at the time? The Hebrew genuinely permits both readings, and the phrase "and also afterwards" has the feel of a later editorial note added by someone trying to reconcile this passage with the fact that the word Nephilim turns up again much later, in the Book of Numbers, when the spies come back from Canaan terrified and report that they saw the Nephilim there and felt like grasshoppers by comparison. And what does the divine response actually mean? My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. Is that a shortened lifespan? Is it a countdown to the flood? It is attached to the preceding sentence in a way that suggests cause and effect. but the causation is never spelled out. 4 verses, perhaps 6 or 7 lines of Hebrew, and practically every clause in it is contested. There is a strong scholarly view that what we are looking at here is a fragment, a compressed remnant of a much larger story, one that circulated in ancient Israel and its neighbors, that the compilers of Genesis knew perfectly well, and that they included in this stripped-down form because they could not simply leave it out, but did not wish to dwell on it either. It has the texture of something summarized rather than something composed. It sits in the text like a stone in a field, obviously carried there from somewhere else. Over the following centuries, 3 main ways of reading it emerged, and the argument between them has never entirely ended. The first, and by far the oldest attested reading, is the plain one. The sons of God are divine beings, members of the heavenly court, the same category of being as those who present themselves before God in Job. Heavenly beings came down and had physical relationships with human women, and the offspring were extraordinary. This is how essentially every Jewish interpreter we can identify in the Second Temple period understood it. It is how the Jewish historian Josephus described it in the 1st century, comparing the offspring to the giants of Greek tradition. It is how the earliest Christian writers understood it, including Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, and Athenagoras. It is, to be blunt, the reading that the plain sense of the Hebrew supports. The second reading treats the sons of God as human rulers. On this view, the phrase is a royal title. Ancient Near Eastern kings were commonly described as sons of a god, adopted by the deity, divine by appointment. So what Genesis is describing is not a supernatural union, but an abuse of power. Powerful men, tyrants, dynasts, taking any woman they chose, which is exactly what the verb suggests, and producing dynasties of violent, renowned warriors. This reading is found in some later Jewish sources, including certain Aramaic translations that render the phrase as sons of nobles or sons of judges, and it has been revived by a number of modern scholars who find it fits the surrounding narrative of escalating human violence rather well. The third reading is the one that dominated Western Christianity for well over 1,000 years, and it is called the Sethite interpretation. On this view, the sons of God are the righteous descendants of Seth, the good line, and the daughters of humans are the descendants of Cain, the corrupted line. The sin, then, is intermarriage between the faithful and the unfaithful, the dissolving of a boundary between the holy community and the world. Nothing supernatural occurs at all. This reading appears in Christian writers from around the 3rd century onwards, notably Julius Africanus, and it was decisively promoted by Augustine in the City of God in the early 5th century. Once Augustine had endorsed it, it became the standard reading in the Latin West for the entire medieval period. It is worth pausing on why that shift happened, because it tells you a great deal about how interpretation works. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Christian theology had developed a much more refined doctrine of what angels were. They were increasingly understood as purely spiritual beings, incorporeal, sexless, incapable of physical union by their very nature. Against that framework, the older reading was not merely uncomfortable, it was philosophically impossible. If angels have no bodies, they cannot father children. So the passage had to mean something else, and the Sethite reading gave it something else to mean. The older reading never disappeared entirely. It survived in the Eastern churches longer and in Jewish mystical literature, and it came roaring back in the modern period once ancient texts that had been lost to the West were rediscovered. But for most of European history, the standard educated Christian answer to what happened in Genesis 6 was that some good men married some bad women. Now here is the question I want to leave hanging over the rest of this documentary. If those 4 verses are all that the Hebrew Bible gives us, and they are, then where did everything else come from? Because there is an everything else. There are names, 200 rebels and their leaders, listed individually. There is a mountain and an oath sworn upon it. There is a detailed inventory of the forbidden knowledge they taught, subject by subject. There are giants who devastate the earth and turn on each other. There are archangels who petition heaven on behalf of a screaming world. There is a binding and a pit and a judgment and a chained figure lying in the darkness of the desert until the end of days. There is an old man who is taken up into heaven and made to carry a message that the heavenly beings themselves are too frightened to deliver. None of that is in Genesis. All of it is in a book that most people in the Western world had never heard of 250 years ago. In the year 1773, a Scottish traveller named James Bruce came back to Europe after 6 years in Africa, carrying manuscripts. Bruce was a large, difficult, magnificently self-assured man who had gone looking for the source of the Nile and had spent years in the highlands of Ethiopia, in a Christian kingdom that had preserved its own ancient traditions in near total isolation from European Christianity for more than a millennium. Among the things he brought back were copies of a text in Ge'ez, the classical liturgical language of Ethiopia. It was a book that European scholars had known about only as a rumor, quoted here and there by early church writers, referred to and then lost. It was the Book of Enoch. For centuries in the West, it had been a ghost. Ancient authors mentioned it. One line of it was quoted in the New Testament. Church fathers argued about it and then largely stopped. The actual text had vanished from Latin and Greek Christianity so completely that some scholars doubted it had ever really existed as a full book at all. And all that time it had been sitting in the churches and monasteries of Ethiopia, copied and recopied, read and preserved, part of the biblical canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which it remains to this day. It took another 48 years before an English translation appeared, published by Richard Lawrence in 1821. And when educated Europeans finally read it, they found something they were not remotely prepared for. Let me set the book in its place, because this is where accuracy really matters. What we call First Enoch is not a single book by a single author. It is a compilation, an anthology of at least 5 distinct works that grew up around the figure of Enoch across several centuries, eventually gathered into one collection. Enoch himself is a minor character in Genesis, mentioned in the genealogy before the flood in a single tantalizing verse. He walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. 7th from Adam. He does not die, he is simply taken. And in the ancient world, a figure who does not die, but is removed to the divine realm, is an irresistible narrative opportunity, because he can be made to report back. The 5 main sections are these: the Book of the Watchers, which is chapters 1 to 36, and which is the part we are concerned with tonight. The Book of Parables or Similitudes, chapters 37 to 71. The Astronomical Book, chapters 72 to 82, sometimes called the Book of the Luminaries. The Book of Dreams, chapters 83 to 90, which includes a remarkable allegorical history of Israel told entirely through animals. And the Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91 to 108. The dating is a matter of ongoing scholarly discussion, but the broad consensus places the Astronomical Book and the Book of the Watchers as the oldest layers, with material likely reaching back into the 3rd century before the Common Era, possibly earlier, which means the developed story of the Watchers, in written form, is older than the Book of Daniel. It is older than several parts of the Hebrew Bible in their final form. This is not a late medieval fantasy. It is an ancient Jewish text from the heart of the Second Temple period. And it was not a marginal curiosity. This is the part that genuinely surprises people. The Book of the Watchers was read, copied, quoted, and expanded across the ancient Jewish and early Christian world. The Book of Jubilees, another Second Temple Jewish text, retells the story. The Damascus document, one of the major texts of the community associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, refers to the watchers of heaven falling. The letter of Jude in the New Testament quotes 1 Enoch directly and by name, attributing the prophecy to Enoch, the seventh from Adam, which is not a casual allusion but an explicit citation of the book as authoritative prophecy. Tertullian, writing around the beginning of the 3rd century, defended the book's authenticity and complained that people rejected it because they did not want to accept what it said. Fragments of it in Greek survived in Egypt. A section of it turns up in a 9th century Byzantine chronicle. And then, for reasons that had more to do with the gradual consolidation of canon lists and the changing theology of angels than with any dramatic act of suppression, it drifted out of use in the Greek and Latin churches. Augustine's assessment in The City of God was influential and dismissive. The book, he argued, contained things that were not credible, and its antiquity made it suspect rather than authoritative. The Sethite reading of Genesis 6 made the Enochic story theologically unnecessary, and so the text quietly ceased to be copied in the West. I want to be very clear about something here, because it is one of the most common claims made about this book, and it is misleading. You will frequently hear that the Book of Enoch was removed from the Bible, that there was once a complete, agreed Bible containing Enoch, and that at some point a council or a pope or a conspiracy took it out. That is not what happened. There was never a single moment when one universally agreed canon existed and a book was deleted from it. Different Jewish and Christian communities held different collections of authoritative texts, and those collections stabilized at different times in different places, through a long and often untidy process. Enoch was widely read and highly regarded in some communities, and never accepted in others. In Ethiopia it was included, and it is still included. In the Latin West it was gradually excluded. There is no secret archive. There is no missing chapter of your Bible hidden in a Vatican basement. There is a complicated history of communities disagreeing about which books mattered, which is far more interesting than a conspiracy and considerably better documented. Now, the second discovery. In the winter of 1946, or the early months of 1947, depending on which reconstruction you follow, a young Bedouin shepherd of the Tamira tribe was looking for a lost animal in the cliffs above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, near a ruin called Khirbet Qumran. He threw a stone into a cave opening and heard something break. What followed, over the next decade, was the recovery of the greatest manuscript find in the history of biblical scholarship. 11 caves, tens of thousands of fragments, roughly 900 separate manuscripts, hidden, it appears, around the time of the Jewish revolt against Rome in the 1st century of the Common Era, and preserved by the extraordinary dryness of that landscape. I want you to picture the place, because it matters. The Dead Sea sits in the deepest land depression on Earth, more than 400 meters below sea level. The air is heavy and hot. The water is so saturated with salt that nothing lives in it, and a human body cannot sink. The cliffs above it are pale, crumbling, riddled with caves, and the light on them at the end of the day turns the color of old bone. It is one of the least hospitable landscapes in the world, and it is precisely that hostility, the absence of moisture, the absence of life, that allowed sheets of animal skin covered in ink to survive for 2,000 years in the dark. And among those fragments, in Cave 4 in particular, were manuscripts of the Book of Enoch, not in Ge'ez, not in Greek, in Aramaic, the language in which the earliest sections were almost certainly composed, copies of the Book of the Watchers, of the astronomical book, of the Book of Dreams, of the Epistle. Multiple copies, in different hands, from different periods, some of them paleographically dated to the 2nd century before the Common Era. The French scholar Joseph Milik spent decades on the Aramaic Enoch fragments and published the major edition in 1976, and the picture that emerged transformed the field. Think about what that meant. For 1500 years, Western scholars had regarded the Book of Enoch, if they thought about it at all, as a curiosity, a late and eccentric production, marginal to the real story of ancient Judaism. And here it was, in the original language, in multiple copies, in a library assembled by a Jewish community 2 centuries before the Common Era, sitting alongside copies of Genesis and Isaiah and the Psalms. Not marginal at all, and central, copied as often as some of the books that made it into everyone's Bible. There was one striking absence which scholars have discussed ever since: the Book of Parables. The section of 1st Enoch containing the most developed messianic figure, the Son of Man material, is not represented among the Qumran fragments at all, which most scholars take as evidence that it was composed later than the other sections, probably around the turn of the era. But the watchers were there, the descent, the oath, the teaching, the giants, the judgment, in Aramaic, on skin, in a cave above a dead sea, a story that the Western world had almost entirely forgotten had been lying in the dark all along, in the exact landscape where it was set. So let us open the book and let the story begin properly. The Book of the Watchers starts with a few chapters of blessing and judgment, a vision of the Holy One coming forth with his hosts, and a long meditation on the reliability of the natural world. Enoch observes that the sun and the moon keep their appointed courses, that the trees know when to shed their leaves and when to bring them back, that the sea keeps to its bed. Everything in creation, he says, does what it was made to do, without deviation, without complaint. Everything except one category of being. And then, in the 6th chapter, the narrative begins, and it begins almost word for word where Genesis begins, which is the clearest possible indication that the 2 texts are drawing on the same tradition. It came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days beautiful and comely daughters were born to them. Now imagine what happens next, not as a scene of flame and thunder, but as something quieter and stranger and far more unsettling. Somewhere above the world, in the ordered ranks of heaven, a group of beings, whose entire purpose is watching, begin to watch something they were not sent to watch. They are the watchers. That is what they do. They observe. They do not sleep. They are the eyes of the divine court over the world below. And at some point, their attention drifts from the whole to the particular, from the pattern to the individual, from creation as a system to a woman walking beside a river with a jar on her shoulder. The text says simply that they saw and lusted after them. And then comes the detail that I find the most human thing in the entire book. They talk about it. They do not act on impulse. They hold what is essentially a meeting. Their leader is named Shemi-Hazah, or in the Ethiopic tradition, Semjaza, and he says something extraordinary. He says, "I fear that you will not agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty for a great sin." There it is. Not defiance, not a cry of freedom, fear of being left holding the blame. And the others answer him with an oath. "Let us all swear and bind one another with a curse, that none of us will turn back from this plan until we accomplish it." 200 of them, the text says, descend in the days of Jared, and they descend onto the summit of a mountain, and the mountain is named Hermon. Mount Hermon is a real place, and if you have never seen it, it is worth holding in your mind. It stands at the southern end of the anti-Lebanon range, on the borders of modern Lebanon, Syria, and the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights, rising to more than 2,500 meters. It is the highest point in the entire region, and it is capped with snow for much of the year, which in that landscape of dust and heat makes it look genuinely otherworldly, a white summit floating above a brown country. Its slopes feed the springs that become the Jordan. In the ancient world, it was ringed with sanctuaries and temples, a holy mountain for multiple peoples across many centuries. the kind of place where the boundary between the human world and the divine one was understood to be thin. There is also a piece of wordplay in the text that only works in Hebrew, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The name Hermon resembles the Hebrew root herem, associated with a ban, a curse, something devoted and set apart. And the text says that they called the mountain Hermon because they swore and bound themselves by a curse upon it. So the mountain of the oath, the mountain of the ban. The book then does something that always startles first-time readers. It gives us a list of names, not vague ranks. Names, individually recorded, of the leaders of tens. Shemihaza, the chief. Then Arachiel, Ramiel, Kokabiel, Tamiel, Ramiel again in some manuscript traditions. Danel, Ezekiel, Barachiel, Asael, Armoros, Batariel, Ananel, Zachiel, Samsiel, Satariel, Turiel, Yomiel, Sariel. The lists vary between manuscripts and between the Aramaic and Ethiopic traditions, and the spellings shift, which is exactly what you would expect of names transmitted across 3 languages and 2,000 years. And look at what the names mean, because it is one of the most revealing details in the whole text. Kokabil contains Kokab, star. Barachiel contains Barak, lightning. Shamsiel contains Shemesh, sun. Sariel and several others are formed from natural phenomena, and every one of them ends in El, God. These are not demon names. They are the names of angels of natural forces, the beings you would expect to be responsible for the star, the storm, the sun. Officials of the created order, the ones whose job it was to keep the machinery running, which makes what follows so much worse. Now hold the scene. A summit in the darkness, snow on the rock, the whole Levant spread below and invisible. 200 beings standing in a circle, swearing an oath to each other rather than to anyone above them, binding themselves together with a curse so that no individual can withdraw and leave the rest exposed. They are not storming a throne. They have not been expelled. Nobody has thrown them out. They walk down out of heaven by mutual agreement, in an orderly fashion, with a plan and a leadership structure and a shared understanding of the risk. That is a very different image from the one in Paradise Lost, and I think it is a far more disturbing one. There is no grandeur in it. There is something almost bureaucratic about it, a group of colleagues talking themselves into something, reassuring one another, agreeing that if they all do it, none of them can be singled out, and then they take wives, and they go into them, and the text says, they began to defile themselves with them. Now why does this matter so much to the ancient writer? What is the crime? It is worth asking, because the Book of the Watchers never suggests the human women are at fault, and it never suggests that sexuality itself is evil. The problem is not desire, the problem is category. In the thought world of these texts, creation works because everything remains what it is. Kinds do not mix. The heavenly and the earthly are not the same order of being and are not meant to combine. Later in the book, God's own indictment of the Watchers makes the logic explicit. You are holy, spiritual, living an eternal life, and you defiled yourselves with the blood of women. You have done as those who are flesh and blood do, but they die and perish. And that is why I gave them wives, so they could have children and not vanish from the earth. You were not given wives because you were spirits and eternal and had no need of them. Read it again, and there is something almost sorrowful in it. Mortals reproduce because mortals die. Reproduction is the compensation for mortality. Beings who cannot die have no business in that arrangement at all. The Watchers, in other words, do not simply break a rule. They reach for a consolation designed for creatures who need consoling, and in doing so, they open a door that was supposed to stay shut. But the marriages, extraordinary as they are, turn out not to be the real catastrophe. 2 other things come through that door behind them. One of them will be born, the other will be taught. There is a second figure in this story, and in some ways he is the more important of the two. In the Aramaic fragments from Qumran, he is generally called Azazel. In the Ethiopic tradition, and in the version that shaped later imagination, he is Azazel. And scholars have noticed for a long time that the material about him sits slightly awkwardly beside the material about Shemi-Haza, as though two originally separate traditions have been woven together. The Israeli scholar Devorah Dimant and others have argued in detail for exactly this: a Shemi-Haza strand about forbidden union, and a distinct Azazel strand about forbidden knowledge, joined into a single narrative at some point in the text's development. You can feel the seam when you read it. The story keeps returning to Azazel as though he, rather than the official leader, is the one who really ruined everything. And what did he do? He taught. According to the 8th chapter of the Book of the Watchers, Azazel taught human beings to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates. He showed them the metals of the earth and the art of working them. He taught them about bracelets and ornaments, about the use of antimony, about the beautifying of the eyelids, about all kinds of precious stones and dyes. Pause on that combination, because it is one of the most interesting lists in ancient literature. Weapons and cosmetics, armor and eye paint, metallurgy and jewelry. At first glance it looks almost comic. What is a bronze sword doing in the same sentence as mascara? But the ancient writer is not being random. He is describing two technologies of transformation, and both of them do the same thing. They take raw material out of the ground and turn it into power over other people. Consider the sword first, and consider it seriously, not as a prop, but as a genuine turning point in human history. Metallurgy is one of the most astonishing things our species has ever worked out. Somebody, somewhere, in a fire hot enough and by a process nobody fully understands, noticed that certain heavy stones would weep a bright liquid, and that the liquid would harden into something that could be shaped, sharpened, and shaped again. That discovery changed everything. Plowshares, axes, nails, cooking vessels, surgical instruments. The physical infrastructure of civilization is metal, and the same knowledge, in the same hands, on the same day, produces the blade. There is no version of metallurgy that gives you the plow and withholds the sword. They are the same skill. That is the point the text is making. Once you know how to release metal from stone, the entire subsequent history of human violence becomes available, and it becomes available immediately, at the same instant as everything good that metal makes possible. Then consider the cosmetics, which modern readers usually find bewildering or misogynistic, and which is neither, entirely, if you think about what the writer is seeing. Antimony, coal, malachite green, ochre, groundstones and metallic compounds applied to the face. In the ancient Near East and Egypt, this was an enormous industry, tied up with status, ritual, medicine, and social display. And the writer, watching this, sees the same structure he saw in the sword, something dug out of the ground, something processed by specialists, something that changes how one human being appears to another, and therefore changes who gets chosen, who gets obeyed, who gets desired, who gets power. Adornment as a technology of influence, appearance as a manufactured commodity, beauty separated from the person and turned into something that can be bought, applied, competed over, and used. You could argue that this is a rather sour view of both eyeliner and human nature, and you would have a point. But watch what the writer does with it. He does not say metal is evil. He does not say beauty is evil. He says these things were shown to people who then did what people do with them. And then there is the question of who Azazel is in the first place, because his name has a history that runs backwards into something genuinely strange. Turn to the 16th chapter of Leviticus, the ritual for the Day of Atonement. The high priest takes 2 goats. Lots are cast over them. One lot is for the Lord, and that goat is sacrificed. The other lot is, in Hebrew, La Azazel, for Azazel, and that goat is not killed. The priest lays both hands on its head, confesses over it all the iniquities of the people, transfers them onto the animal, and the goat is led out and released into the wilderness, into a land cut off, carrying the sins away. That is where the English word scapegoat comes from, coined by William Tyndale in the 16th century as a way of rendering a phrase nobody could confidently translate. And nobody can confidently translate it still. Azazel might be a place, a rocky precipice. It might be an abstract noun, meaning something like complete removal. It might, and many scholars think it most likely, be the name of an entity associated with the wilderness, a desert power to whom the impurity is sent, out beyond the ordered world where it belongs. If that is right, then Azazel was already, long before the Book of the Watchers, a name attached to the wilderness and to the removal of sin. And what the Enochic tradition does with that is remarkable. In the 10th chapter, when judgment finally comes, the archangel Raphael is told to bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness, into an opening in the desert, and to cover him with rough and jagged rocks, and to leave him there until the great day of judgment. And then comes the line that closes the circle. The whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin, the bearer of sin, sent out into the desert, into a land cut off. The goat and the angel are performing the same function, and the ancient writer knows it. Which brings us to the question that runs underneath this entire documentary, and I want to put it as clearly as I can, because everything that follows tonight is an attempt to sit with it. Is knowledge dangerous because of what it contains? Or is it dangerous because of what we are? The Enochic text can be read either way, and I suspect the ambiguity is deliberate. On one reading, the knowledge itself is illicit. It is heavenly property. It was not ours to have, and receiving it is a kind of theft, regardless of what we do with it afterwards. On the other reading, and this is the reading I find far more interesting, the knowledge is morally neutral, and the catastrophe is entirely in the timing. Human beings received the ability to do enormous things before they had developed any framework for deciding what should be done. Capability arrived first. Wisdom did not arrive at all, or arrived far too late, or arrived and was ignored. A sword defends a village. A sword empties one. Metal builds an aqueduct. Metal builds a siege engine. The knowledge to heal is the knowledge to poison. The same anatomy, learned for the same reason, serves both. And the text does not resolve it for us. It simply records that the teaching happened, that the world changed, and that it could not be changed back. Azazel was not the only teacher. The Book of the Watchers goes on to distribute the curriculum among the others. And this is where the ancient text starts to feel genuinely eerie, because what is being described is nothing less than the founding syllabus of civilization. Shemi Hazar, the text says, taught spellbinding and the cutting of roots. Hermon taught the loosing of spells, enchantments, and skills. Barakiel taught the signs of the lightning flashes. Kokabeel taught the signs of the stars. Zekiel taught the signs of the shooting stars. Artikov taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sahriel taught the signs of the moon. Others are credited with the movements of the clouds, with the observation of the winds, with divination from natural phenomena. And in a later section of the collection, in a passage that appears in the Book of Parables, there is a figure named Penamue, and what he is said to have taught is the most consequential thing on the entire list. He taught human beings the bitter and the sweet, and he showed them the secrets of wisdom. He taught them writing with ink and paper, and through this, the text says, many have gone astray from eternity until this day, because human beings were not created for the purpose of confirming their good faith with pen and ink. Writing, listed as a corruption. Before we go further, a necessary word about the lists themselves, because I promised at the start that I would be honest with you about the state of the evidence. These lists are not stable. They vary between the Aramaic fragments from Qumran, the surviving Greek witnesses, and the Ethiopic manuscript tradition. Names shift. Assignments move from one figure to another. Some subjects appear in one version and not in another. The material about Penemusi and Castasia belongs to a different section of 1st Enoch, composed later than the Book of the Watchers, and should not be treated as though it were part of the same original account. Anyone who presents you with a tidy, definitive table of which angel taught which subject is smoothing over a genuinely messy textual situation. The broad shape is consistent, the details are not. That is normal for ancient literature, and pretending otherwise would be doing you a disservice. But look at the shape, the knowledge of the stars, the knowledge of the earth, the knowledge of the weather, the knowledge of plants and their properties, the knowledge of ritual formulae, the knowledge of writing, and, from Azazel, the knowledge of metals and of adornment. That is not a list of evil arts. That is, more or less, the intellectual inventory of an ancient civilization. It is what the temple scribes of Babylon knew. It is what the Egyptian priesthood knew. It is what made an advanced society advanced. And this is where we have to make a real effort of historical imagination, because the modern mind sorts these subjects into categories that did not exist yet. We hear astrology and astronomy as two words, one superstition and one science. In the ancient Near East, they were a single discipline. The Babylonian scholars who compiled the Great Celestial Omen series, who tracked the movements of the planets across generations, who produced mathematical astronomy of a sophistication that still astonishes historians, were not doing science on Tuesdays and superstition on Thursdays. They were reading the sky, because the sky was the most legible thing in the universe, and it told you when to plant, when to expect the river, when the year turned, and, they believed, what the gods intended. We hear enchantment and think of nonsense. In that world, the correct words spoken over an illness were part of the same body of expertise as the correct root dug up and prepared. Medicine, ritual, and pharmacology were not separate professions. The person who knew which plant reduced a fever also knew what to say while administering it, and both were forms of knowing how the world worked. We hear divination and think of fairground tents. In that world, divination was an enormously sophisticated technical discipline, with vast written literatures, practiced by educated specialists attached to royal courts, and it was, in a real sense, the ancient equivalent of intelligence analysis. It was how a state tried to see the future in order to make decisions. So when the Book of the Watchers condemns these subjects, it is not condemning superstition, it is condemning expertise. It is looking at the entire apparatus of learned civilization and saying, that came from somewhere, and where it came from was not permitted. Which raises the question I think is the single most interesting one in the whole tradition. Why would knowledge of the stars be forbidden? Nothing could seem more innocent. Looking up, noticing patterns, writing down what you see. There is no violence in it. Nobody is hurt by an observation. And yet the ancient writer puts it beside the sword. I think the answer is power, and I think it becomes obvious the moment you stop thinking about astronomy as a hobby and start thinking about it as a technology. To know the movements of the sun and the stars is to know the calendar. To know the calendar is to know when to plant, when to harvest, when the flood will come, when the rains will fail. It is to know when the festivals fall, and therefore when the entire religious life of a people takes place. Whoever controls the calendar controls the year, and whoever controls the year controls the rhythm of every life inside it. This was not an abstract matter in the Second Temple period. It was ferociously contested. The community associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls followed a solar calendar of 364 days, the same calendar promoted in the astronomical Book of Enoch and in Jubilees. and they regarded the lunar calendar used in the Jerusalem temple as an error that put the whole nation out of step with the order of creation. People broke with the central institution of their religion over this. To know the properties of plants is to be able to heal, and to be able to poison, and to be the only person in the village who can tell the difference. To know how to read the omens is to be able to tell a king what the gods want, which is to be able to tell a king what to do. To know how to write is to be able to fix a claim in a form that outlasts memory. A debt recorded is a debt that cannot be forgotten. A law written down is a law that cannot be quietly adjusted. A treaty, a deed, a tax roll, a genealogy establishing who has the right to rule. Writing is the technology of the permanent claim, and the Enochic text says, with real perception, that human beings were not made to confirm their good faith with pen and ink, which is to say, once you can write it down, you no longer need to be trustworthy. The document does your trusting for you. Every item on that list is a lever. Every one of them lets a small number of people act upon a large number of people. And the story is quite specific about the sequence. The knowledge does not emerge from human effort, slowly, in step with the moral development of the people acquiring it. It arrives, fully formed, from outside, delivered by beings who understood it, and to people who did not. Capability, handed to a species that had not yet built anything capable of holding it. That is what the ancient writer is frightened of. Not the stars, not the metal, not the ink, the gap. And while all of this was being taught, something was being born. The children of the Watchers are the part of the story that has traveled furthest into popular imagination, and they are also the part where the distance between what the ancient texts actually say and what people believe they say is at its widest. So let us go carefully, start with the word Nephilim. It appears in the Hebrew Bible exactly twice, in Genesis 6 and in the report of the spies in Numbers 13, where the frightened scouts returning from Canaan say that they saw the Nephilim there, the sons of Anak, and that they seemed to themselves like grasshoppers. That second passage is the reason the giant tradition exists. It is the spies who introduce the idea of enormous size, and they introduce it in a report that the book itself frames as an exaggeration born of fear. It is a bad report, delivered by men who have lost their nerve. The etymology is genuinely uncertain. The most commonly proposed derivation connects the word to the Hebrew root nafal, to fall, which would make the Nephilim the fallen ones, and this is where a great deal of confusion between fallen angels and their offspring originates. Others have suggested a connection to an Aramaic word meaning giant, or have argued that the root sense is something more like those who fall upon others, which would make them raiders or attackers rather than either giants or the fallen. Genesis itself glosses them as the Gibborim, the mighty ones, the heroes of old, men of renown, warriors, famous names, the kind of figure who ends up in a song. Then the Greek translators of the Septuagint, working in Alexandria in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era, rendered the word as gigantes, giants. And with that single translation decision, a Hebrew word of uncertain meaning was permanently attached to the Greek mythological tradition of enormous primeval beings, born of heaven and earth, who warred against the gods, which was, in fairness, a reasonable translation, because by then, the Enochic tradition had already developed the idea considerably. In the Book of the Watchers, the offspring are enormous, and the text gives them a height, and the numbers in the manuscripts are wildly inconsistent, which itself tells you something about how this material was transmitted. And what they do, according to the Ethiopic text, is consume. They devour the produce of all human labor until people can no longer sustain them. Then they turn against humanity and begin to devour them. Then they sin against the birds and the beasts and the reptiles and the fish, and devour one another's flesh, and drink the blood. Sit with the structure of that, because it is not a monster story. It is an economic collapse described as an appetite. First, they eat the surplus. Then they eat the seed corn. Then they eat the people. Then they eat the animals. Then they eat each other. It is a description of a system consuming its own foundations, stage by stage, until nothing remains to consume. It is famine and warlordism, and the collapse of the arrangements by which a society feeds itself, told in the form of a giant with an endless hunger. And the earth itself, in the text, cries out. That is the image that carries the chapter, not the giants roaring, the ground complaining. The lawless ones have made the earth cry out against them. I want to be very clear about how to hold this material. This is ancient mythological and theological storytelling. It is not a suppressed historical record of a race of enormous hominids. There is no credible archaeological evidence for giant humanoids, and the photographs and skeletons that circulate online under that heading are, without exception, hoaxes, digital composites, or misidentified remains, many of them traceable to specific fabrications and photo manipulation contests. Where genuinely unusual skeletal remains have been recovered from antiquity, they are almost always explained by known conditions, such as gigantism, arising from pituitary tumors, which occur in every human population and always have. The archaeologist's answer here is dull, and it is also correct. What is genuinely worth asking is a different question. What did giants mean? Because ancient cultures across an enormous geographical range imagined them, and they consistently imagined them doing the same kinds of work in a story. Giants represent the primeval. They belong to the time before the current order, when the world was still unfinished and its rules were not yet fixed. The Greeks had the Titans, born of Uranus and Gaia, heaven and earth, overthrown by the Olympians and imprisoned beneath the world. Mesopotamian tradition had its own primordial monstrous beings, defeated before the ordered cosmos could be established. Norse tradition had the Jotnar, older than the gods, associated with mountains and frost and the wild edges of the map. In story after story, the establishment of order requires the defeat and confinement of something enormous that came first. Giants represent chaos. They are what the world looks like when force operates without limit. They do not negotiate, they do not farm, they do not build, they consume. A giant is what a human being would be if there were no consequences. Giants represent illegitimate power. Look at how often they are associated with kings, warlords, and conquerors. Genesis calls the Nephilim the mighty men, the men of renown, and renown is precisely what a warrior aristocracy accumulates. A tradition that describes the pre-flood world as being ruled by monstrous hybrid warriors who devoured everything is not making a zoological claim, it is making a political one. And giants represent the wrong kind of mixture. This is the deepest layer, and it connects to everything we said about boundaries. The offspring of the Watchers are neither heavenly nor earthly. They belong to no category. They cannot be classified. And in a thought world where holiness means being properly distinguished, being unclassifiable is itself a form of horror. There is one more text worth mentioning, because it is one of the most remarkable discoveries at Qumran, and it is barely known outside specialist circles. Among the Aramaic fragments there are pieces of a work scholars call the Book of Giants. It tells the story from the giants' own perspective. Two of them, named Ohia and Hahia, sons of Shemi-Haza, have terrifying dreams. In one, a tablet is thrown into water, and the writing on it is washed away except for a few letters. In another, a great tree is uprooted, and only one root and 3 of its branches survive. The giants cannot interpret their own nightmares. So they send one of their number to find Enoch, the scribe, the only one who can read what heaven is saying. And Enoch tells them what they already suspect, which is that they are going to be destroyed, and that there will be no reprieve. And in one of the strangest details in all of ancient literature, the fragments contain a name that has no business being there at all. Gilgamesh, the hero of the great Mesopotamian epic, appearing as one of the giants, alongside another name, Humbaba, the monstrous guardian of the cedar forest whom Gilgamesh kills in the epic, an ancient Jewish text about the sons of fallen angels, quietly absorbing the most famous hero of Mesopotamian literature and filing him under monsters. The Book of Giants had an extraordinary afterlife. Centuries later, it was taken up and reworked by the Manichaean religion founded by the prophet Mani in 3rd century Persia, and versions of it traveled with Manichaean missionaries across Central Asia. Fragments have been recovered from the desert oases of the Silk Road, in Middle Persian, in Sogdian, in Uyghur, a story about giants who dream of their own destruction, carried on camelback across the Taklamakan, and buried in sand for 1,000 years. Now let the story darken, slowly. What the Book of the Watchers describes in its 9th and 10th chapters is not a battle. It is the aftermath of a decision, spreading outward through a world, the way water spreads through a floor. Picture it as a sequence rather than an event. The knowledge arrives. At first, it looks like a gift, and for a while, it probably is one. There is more food, because people understand the season better. There is less illness, because someone has learned what the root does. There are tools, and the tools make more tools, and a village becomes a town. Then someone makes a blade, and someone else has to make a better one. Then the ornaments appear, and status crystallizes around them, and for the first time it becomes possible to see at a glance who matters and who does not. Then the hybrid offspring grow, and they consume, and the surplus that made all the rest of it possible begins to disappear. And by the time anyone understands what has happened, there is no version of the world left in which the knowledge can be given back. That is the quality I find most striking about the Enochic account of corruption. It is not a story about sudden evil. It is a story about irreversibility. There is no moment where a wise man stands up and says, "We should not do this," and everyone agrees, and it stops. The technology is in the world. The blade exists. The only response available to anyone is to acquire one too. And so, the text says, the earth was filled with blood and iniquity, and oppression increased, and the cry went up to the gates of heaven. There is a beautiful and terrible passage where the dead themselves become the accusers. The souls of those who have been killed cry out, and their voices ascend, and they cannot be silenced, because they are the voices of people to whom nothing further can be done. Now, connect this to the story you already know. In Genesis, immediately after those 4 mysterious verses about the sons of God, the text says that the Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted having made humankind, and it grieved him to his heart. And a few verses later, the earth was corrupt, and the earth was filled with violence. Genesis gives us the flood, and it gives us the reason, which is human violence. And it leaves a strange 4-verse fragment sitting just before the explanation, connected to it by nothing but proximity. The Enochic tradition takes that proximity and makes it into causation. Why was the pre-flood world so violent? Because heavenly beings came down and taught weapons and fathered monsters. That is the answer. The flood is not an arbitrary act of divine temper. It is a response to a catastrophe that came from above and was inflicted on the world below, which does something theologically significant, and this is why scholars have paid so much attention to it. It relocates the origin of evil. In the reading of Genesis that later became standard in Christianity, evil enters the world through Adam and Eve, through human disobedience in a garden. In the Enochic tradition, the emphasis shifts. The garden is not the center of the story. Humanity is, to a considerable extent, a victim. Something was done to the world from outside it. You can hear in that a very particular kind of ancient anxiety, and it is not hard to sympathize with it. It is the sense that the world one has been born into was already broken before one arrived, that the violence in it did not begin with us, that somebody, somewhere, upstream, made choices we are now living inside. The flood, when it comes in the Enochic version, is therefore not only punishment, it is decontamination. The archangels are instructed to tell Noah's father that a deluge is coming and that a remnant will be preserved, and then to heal the earth, which the angels have ruined, and to cleanse it from the corruption. But notice, and this is important, the flood does not solve the underlying problem. It cannot. Because the knowledge survives. Nobody unlearns metallurgy in a boat. Nobody forgets the calendar. Whatever was washed away, the syllabus came through, and so the ancient writer leaves us with a world that has been scoured and restarted and is nevertheless carrying, in its cargo, everything that ruined it the first time. Before the water, though, comes the judgment, and it is one of the most vivid sequences in the whole text. It begins with 4 angels looking down, Michael, Sariel, Raphael, and Gabriel, in the older Aramaic ordering. In much of the later tradition, the 4th is Uriel. They look down from the sanctuary of heaven, and they see the blood being poured out on the earth, and they hear the souls of the dead pleading, and they say to one another, "The earth, made without inhabitant, cries out to the gates of heaven." And then they do something extraordinary for beings of their rank. They complain. They take the case upward. They say, in effect, "You know everything before it happens. You see this, and you do nothing. And you have not told us what we are supposed to do about it." These 4 figures are the origin of the archangel tradition that would eventually fill Western art, and it is worth noticing how little the biblical texts themselves supply. Michael appears in Daniel as the great prince who protects Israel, and in Jude and Revelation. Gabriel appears in Daniel as an interpreter of visions, and in Luke as the announcer of 2 births. Raphael appears in the Book of Tobit, traveling with a young man on a road under an assumed name, and revealing at the end that he is one of the 7 who stand in the presence of the glory. Uriel does not appear in the Hebrew Bible at all. He belongs to this literature, and in the Enochic tradition, he is above all the angel of the luminaries, the one who shows Enoch how the sun and moon and stars actually work. Which is a detail I love, because it means that in the very same collection where the knowledge of the heavens is a crime when the watchers teach it, there is an angel who teaches exactly the same subject with full authority. The difference is not the content, the difference is who is doing the giving, and whether it was sanctioned. The judgment itself comes as a series of commands. Raphael is told to bind Azazel, hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness, into an opening in the desert of Dudael, and to cover him with rough and jagged rocks, and to place darkness upon him, so that he may not see the light, and to leave him there until the great day of judgment, when he will be led away to the burning. Gabriel is sent against the giants, and told not to fight them himself, but to set them against one another, so that they destroy each other in a war of sons. Michael is sent to Shemihaza and the rest, and told to bind them beneath the hills of the earth for 70 generations, until the day of their judgment, when they will be led away to the abyss of fire. And running through all of it is one phrase that keeps returning, and that shapes everything the tradition became afterwards. Bind them, not destroy, not annihilate, bind. The Watchers are not killed because they cannot be. They are immortal, and their immortality, which was the sign of their superiority, becomes the instrument of their punishment. They are placed underneath the world, in darkness, conscious, waiting, for a duration measured in generations. There is a passage later in the book, when Enoch has been sent as an intermediary, where he is asked to carry a petition on their behalf, and he sees them in their distress. They ask him to write a prayer for them, because they can no longer speak, and they cannot lift their eyes to heaven for shame. He writes it, he carries it up, And the answer he brings back is a refusal. You should be interceding for humans, he is told, not humans for you. That reversal is the heart of the tragedy. The beings whose function was to stand between heaven and earth now need a human being to stand between them and heaven, and it does not work. And these ideas traveled. When the letter of Jude in the New Testament refers to angels who did not keep their own position but abandoned their proper dwelling, and says that they have been kept in eternal chains in deepest darkness until the judgment of the great day, it is using the language of this tradition. 2 verses later, Jude quotes 1 Enoch by name. When the second letter of Peter says that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into the deepest pit, using the Greek verb tartarosos, from Tartarus, the Greek underworld of the imprisoned Titans, it is doing the same. When the first letter of Peter speaks obscurely of spirits in prison who were disobedient in the days of Noah, scholars have long argued that the Watcher tradition is the background required to make sense of the passage at all. The chained rebel beneath the world, waiting for a judgment that has not yet arrived, entered Christian imagination through this door. And now we come to the strangest turn in the whole mythology, and the one with the longest consequences. The giants die. Gabriel sets them against one another, and they tear each other apart. And the flood finishes what the civil war began. But something is left over. In the 15th chapter of the Book of the Watchers, God explains to Enoch what will happen to the spirits of the dead giants. And the explanation is one of the eeriest passages in ancient literature. The giants were born of two natures. Their bodies came from women, and their spirits came from the Watchers. And so, the text says, when their bodies are destroyed, their spirits do not go where the spirits of the dead go. They remain. They will be called evil spirits upon the earth, and the earth will be their dwelling. They will rise up against the children of men and against the women, because they came from them. And they will afflict and corrupt and cause trouble, and eat nothing, and thirst, and be invisible. Read that again if you can. They eat nothing, and they thirst, and they are invisible. Beings made of appetite and nothing else. The hunger that consumed the world, released from the bodies that housed it, and left loose in the air with no possible way of being satisfied. They cannot eat, because they have nothing to eat with. They cannot die, because they have already lost the part of them that was capable of dying. And they cannot leave, because the earth is now their dwelling. It says so. That is where a very substantial strand of ancient Jewish demonology comes from, and it is the reason the scholar Archie Wright, among others, has written at length on the Watcher tradition as an origin story for evil spirits. Notice what has happened, because it is genuinely subtle. The demons in this account are not fallen angels. They are the ghosts of the children of fallen angels. There is a generational step in between. The Watchers themselves are bound beneath the earth and are not at large in the world at all. What roams free is something else entirely, a category of being that did not exist before, and that came into existence as a byproduct of a boundary violation. The evil that troubles the world, in this telling, is not a rebel army. It is contamination. It is what was left over. The Book of Jubilees, a related Second Temple text that retells Genesis and Exodus with considerable freedom, develops this further and adds a detail I find quietly devastating. After the flood, Noah's descendants are being led astray by these spirits, and Noah prays for them to be removed entirely. The chief of the spirits, called Mastema, petitions in return, arguing that if all of them are bound, he will be unable to carry out his function of testing humanity, and a compromise is reached. 9/10 are bound, 1/10 is permitted to remain, which is to say, in that tradition, the world we live in is not free of the consequences. It is operating at 10% contamination by divine settlement. Now, an important corrective, because this is where popular presentations of the subject collapse everything into mush. There was never one ancient demonology. There were many, and they disagreed. In Mesopotamian tradition, there were vast populations of harmful spirits with their own names and specialities. Some of them associated with disease, some with the wind, some with the deaths of women in childbirth, and an entire professional literature of incantations for dealing with them. Egyptian tradition had its own categories of hostile beings and its own protective magic. Greek daimon originally meant something close to a divine power or a guiding spirit, and was not necessarily malevolent at all, which is why the philosopher Socrates could speak of his daimonion as an inner voice that warned him away from mistakes. The word only narrowed into something purely evil under later Jewish and Christian usage. Within Jewish literature itself, the picture is varied. Some texts speak of the spirits of the giants. Some speak of Mastema or Belial as a chief adversary. Rabbinic literature of later centuries has a rich and often domestic demonology, with spirits that inhabit particular places and are dealt with by particular precautions, and it does not always tie them to the watchers at all. Some strands of Jewish thought are strikingly uninterested in the whole question and locate the source of human wrongdoing entirely within the human being, in the Yetzer Hara, the inclination towards evil, which is not an external entity but a component of the self. And then, over centuries, in the Christian West particularly, a great flattening occurred. Fallen angel became equal to demon. The rebels of Isaiah 14 became identical with the watchers of Enoch, who became identical with the spirits of the giants, who became identical with the daimones of the Greek world, who became identical with the local gods of every people the church encountered. Since another important early Christian move was to identify the gods of pagan religion as demons in disguise. All of it was gathered into one enormous single category, organized into ranks, given a leader, and set in opposition to the ranks of heaven. By the medieval period, this had become a formal science. Demons were classified, numbered, assigned hierarchies mirroring the celestial ones, given names and titles and legions and specialities. The grimoire literature of the later medieval and early modern period, texts such as the Lesser Key of Solomon, presents catalogues of named spirits with their sigils and offices, 72 of them, each with a rank and a domain of expertise. That literature belongs to its own period and its own concerns, and should never be read backwards into ancient Judaism. But if you go back to the beginning, before the flattening, what you find is stranger and more precise. Heavenly beings who crossed a line and were imprisoned for it. Their children, who were neither one thing nor the other, and who consumed everything and were destroyed. And what was left when those children died? Not angels, not humans, not anything that was ever supposed to exist. Hunger, without a body, still here, still hungry. So how did we get from that to the story everybody knows? This is the crucial section of tonight's documentary, and I want to lay it out clearly, because the process by which several unrelated traditions became one seamless narrative is, to me, more fascinating than any of the individual pieces. Lay the components on the table. There is the accuser in the divine court, Satan, a functionary who tests and prosecutes with divine permission. There is the serpent in the garden, in Genesis 3, who is described simply as the most crafty of the wild animals God had made, and who is never in that text identified with anything else at all. There is the shining one, Hallel ben Shaka, in a taunt song against a Babylonian king. There is the anointed cherub in Eden, in an oracle against a Phoenician ruler. There is Shemihaza, who organizes a descent out of desire. There is Azazel, who teaches the technology of violence and is bound in the desert. There is the dragon in Revelation, the ancient serpent, thrown down after a war in heaven, whose tail sweeps a third of the stars from the sky. 7 separate figures, from at least 4 separate literary contexts, spread across roughly 8 centuries of writing. And the astonishing thing is, that by the 17th century, in the imagination of educated Europe, they are all the same person. The synthesis happened gradually, and it happened for reasons that made sense at each stage. The first pressure was theological. As Jewish and then Christian thought moved towards a stronger conception of a single sovereign and entirely good God, the question of where evil came from became harder rather than easier. If God is good and God is in control, then the sources of suffering need somewhere else to live. A unified adversary answers that need. It gives the problem a shape and a name. The second pressure was interpretative. Early Christian and Jewish readers approached their scriptures as a single unified whole, in which passages illuminated one another, regardless of their original context. If one text describes a heavenly figure falling, and another describes a cherub expelled from Eden, and another describes a dragon cast down, it was not merely permissible, but virtuous to read them together. They were assumed to be talking about the same reality from different angles. The third pressure was polemical. Identifying the gods of surrounding religions as fallen angels or demons gave early Christianity an explanation for why other people's religions were powerful, popular, and apparently effective, without conceding that they were true. And so the pieces fused. The serpent in Eden acquired an identity. The accuser acquired a biography. The Shining One acquired a name in Latin translation and became the account of how the accuser had begun. The war in heaven from Revelation, which in its own context is a vision concerning the end of history, was relocated to the beginning of it, so that the throwing down of the dragon became the primeval fall rather than the final one. And the third of the stars swept away by the dragon's tail became a precise statistic, a third of the angels. Meanwhile, the watchers were pushed to the margins. Once the Sethite reading of Genesis 6 had become standard in the West, and once angels had been defined as incorporeal, the Enochic story became theologically homeless. It survived in fragments, in artistic motifs, in the persistent idea of fallen angels lusting after human women. But it stopped being the main account. The dominant narrative became the story of pride, because pride fitted better with everything else. Pride is the sin of a being who wants to be God. Desire is the sin of a being who wants to be human. Only one of those makes a satisfying opposite number for the divine. And here I want to widen the frame, because this is not only a Jewish and Christian story. Islamic tradition approaches the question differently, and the differences are illuminating. In the Quran, the pivotal moment of rebellion has nothing to do with women or knowledge or the pre-flood world. God creates Adam and commands the angels to prostrate before him. They all do so, except Iblis, who refuses. And his stated reason is a statement of hierarchy. He says he is better than Adam, because he was created from fire and Adam from clay. For that refusal he is expelled, and he asks for and is granted respite until the day of judgment, and he undertakes to lead astray as many human beings as he can. The structure is entirely different from the Enochic account. The sin is not lust and not the theft of knowledge. It is refusal, grounded in a claim of superiority, at the moment when humanity is created. And there is a further theological point of considerable importance. The Quran elsewhere states that Iblis was of the jinn, a distinct category of created being, made of smokeless fire, possessing free will, capable of belief and unbelief. Islamic scholars have discussed at length whether Iblis was an angel who disobeyed, or a jinn who was present among them, with the majority position in most traditions holding that angels do not disobey by nature, and that Iblis was therefore not an angel in the strict sense. Which means that in that tradition the very concept of a fallen angel is theologically problematic in a way it never was for the Enochic writers. And yet there is a second Islamic tradition, and it preserves something remarkably close to the Watchers. In the second chapter of the Quran, there is a brief and enigmatic reference to two angels at Babylon, named Harut and Marut, connected with the teaching of magic, with a warning attached, that they would say to anyone who came to them that they were only a trial and that the person should not disbelieve. The Quranic passage is short, and its interpretation is debated, but an enormous body of later commentary and story grew around it, in which the two angels criticize humanity's weakness, are sent down to be tested, fail, and are punished by being suspended in a pit at Babylon until the day of judgment. Two heavenly beings who came down taught forbidden knowledge and were hung in a pit to wait for judgment. Whether that later material developed independently or absorbed circulating Jewish traditions is exactly the kind of question scholars argue about carefully, and I am not going to pretend to settle it. What is clear is that the shape recurs. Beings from above, a descent, a transgression, forbidden teaching, and confinement until the end. The story kept finding its way back. Let us go back to the mountain, though, and slow down again, because there is something in the original story that all the later systematizing quietly buried, and I think it is the most interesting thing in it. The Watchers do not want a throne. They are not offered a kingdom. They do not demand worship. There is no indication anywhere in the Book of the Watchers that they intend to replace God, or that they resent His authority, or that they have any program of any kind. They are not revolutionaries. They come down because they saw women and wanted them, and because they were afraid to do it alone. That is a startlingly small motive for a catastrophe of that size, and I suspect that smallness is exactly why the story has haunted people for 2,000 years. Grand rebellions are impressive. This is recognizable. This is the shape of most of the actual damage human beings do to their own lives, which is very rarely a matter of grand ambition, and very often a matter of wanting something ordinary, badly, and arranging matters so that it becomes possible. But there is another layer underneath it, and it is stranger still. What exactly are these beings reaching for? They are described as spirits, holy, eternal, not made for reproduction, not made for death, and they descend into the one part of creation that is defined entirely by impermanence. They take wives, they father children, they enter into the whole apparatus of mortality, generation, family, inheritance, loss. You could argue that they are not rebelling against heaven at all. You could argue that they are defecting to earth. And once you see the story that way, its emotional shape changes completely. Because what is it in mortal life that could possibly be worth an eternity in a pit? Perhaps this, that everything here is finite, and finitude is what gives things their weight. A summer that will not come again, a face that is changing while you look at it. The knowledge, present in every embrace, that this arrangement of people in this room will not last, cannot last, and is therefore unrepeatable. Mortals have something that immortal beings by definition cannot have, which is the experience of things mattering because they are running out. To a being who has always existed and always will, human life might look poor and short and frightened, or it might look unbearably vivid. There is an old philosophical intuition here that appears again and again, from ancient poetry to modern essays, that immortality would eventually hollow experience out, because nothing would be at stake in anything. If you have infinite time, every choice is provisional, every loss recoverable, every relationship one of an endless series. The Watchers, in this reading, are beings who look down from a condition of perfect security at creatures living in permanent risk, and find the risk enviable, and they cannot have it. That is the tragedy. They can take wives, and they do. They can father children, and they do. But they remain what they are. When the judgment comes, their punishment is not death, because death is not available to them. It is confinement. They are given the worst possible version of the thing they already had, which is time without end, now with nothing in it. Their children die, their wives die, the world they entered goes on without them, and they remain, underneath it, awake. Writers and artists have circled this for centuries, and the Romantic period in particular became almost preoccupied with it. Byron wrote a drama on the subject, Heaven and Earth, published in 1823, in which angels love mortal women as the flood approaches. Thomas More published The Loves of the Angels in the same year, and it was popular enough to run through multiple editions, and controversial enough that he revised it to make the angels less obviously biblical. Alfred de Vigny wrote Eloah, in which a female angel born from a tear of Christ is drawn to the fallen one out of compassion and is lost by it. Lermontov spent a decade returning to his poem The Demon, in which an immortal being, exhausted by his own endlessness, falls in love with a mortal woman and destroys her simply by loving her. Notice what all of those writers found in the material. Not horror, longing. The fallen angel became, in the 19th century, a figure for the exile who cannot go home and would not necessarily go if he could, for the intelligence that has seen too much to be innocent, for the outsider whose punishment is not pain but permanent distance, and underneath all of it, a question that the ancient text never quite asks but keeps implying. Was the sin that they wanted to be more than they were, or was it that they wanted to be less? Now step back from the Levant for a while and let the view widen, because the watchers are not alone. Somewhere in the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era, a Greek poet called Hesiod wrote down a story about a titan named Prometheus, whose name means forethought. In Hesiod's telling, Prometheus is a trickster who takes the side of humanity against Zeus. He cheats at a sacrifice, arranging the portions so that the gods receive bones wrapped in fat and humans receive the meat. Zeus, in retaliation, withholds fire from mortals, and Prometheus steals it, hiding the ember in the hollow stalk of a fennel plant, and carries it down. The punishment is famous. Prometheus is chained to a rock at the edge of the world, and an eagle comes each day to eat his liver, which regenerates each night, so that the torment can begin again. Immortality, once again, turned into an instrument. But the punishment of humanity is the part people forget. Zeus does not only chain the thief, he sends a gift. A woman, made by the gods, given beauty by Aphrodite, and cunning speech by Hermes, and a jar. When the jar is opened, everything that afflicts human life escapes into the world, and only hope remains inside. Aeschylus, writing in Athens in the 5th century, reshaped Prometheus into something closer to a hero, and in the surviving play Prometheus Bound the Titan lists what he gave. Not only fire, he gave them numbers and writing and the yoking of animals and ships and the reading of dreams and omens and medicine and the working of metals beneath the earth. He says that before he came, human beings had eyes but did not see, and ears but did not hear, and lived in caves without knowledge of the seasons. Set that beside the Book of the Watchers, and the parallel is impossible to miss. Two texts, from cultures in contact but with quite different religious commitments, both explaining the arrival of civilization as a gift from a divine being who was punished for giving it. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where documentaries about this subject start claiming that all myths are secretly the same myth, and that is not a claim the evidence supports. Prometheus is not Azazel. The stories have different structures and different moral centers. Prometheus acts out of love for humanity, and the text treats him with sympathy. Azazel acts as part of a group transgression, and the text treats him as the origin of all sin. In Greek tradition, the giver is the hero. In the Enochic tradition, he is the criminal. But the pattern recurs too widely to be a coincidence, and the pattern itself is what interests me. Mesopotamian tradition had the Apkallu, 7 sages sent by the god Ea before the flood, who came out of the water and taught humanity the arts of civilization, the crafts, the cities, the writing, the law. The Babylonian priest Berosus, writing in Greek in the 3rd century before the Common Era, preserved a version in which a creature called Oannes, part fish, emerged from the sea each day to teach and returned to the water each night. Sumerian and Akkadian traditions speak of the Me, the divine decrees or offices underlying civilization, and of how they were transferred, or in one famous story, stolen while their keeper was drunk, and brought to a city. Scholars including James Vanderkam have explored the striking parallels between Enoch himself and the Mesopotamian figure Enmeduranki, a pre-flood king associated with the sun god and with the transmission of divination techniques, who is likewise the seventh in a list. Enoch is the seventh from Adam. He is taken up. He learns the secrets of the heavens and writes them down. The resemblance is not proof of borrowing, but it strongly suggests that the Enochic writers were working within a wider ancient Near Eastern conversation about primeval sages and heavenly knowledge, and were making a deliberate counter-argument inside it. Because that is what the Book of the Watchers is doing, once you see it. In Babylon, the sages who taught civilization before the flood are benefactors, sent by a god, remembered with honor, invoked in rituals of protection. In the Book of the Watchers, the beings who taught civilization before the flood are criminals who ruined the world. That is not an accident. That is a Jewish text, written in a period when Judea sat under the cultural weight of enormous Hellenistic and Mesopotamian civilizations. Looking at the achievements of those civilizations, at their astronomy and their metallurgy and their divination and their libraries, and saying, "We know where that came from, and it did not come from heaven with permission." The pattern is worldwide. Trickster figures who steal fire appear in traditions across the Americas, Oceania and Africa, sometimes in the form of a raven, a coyote, a spider. Culture heroes who bring agriculture or writing or law and pay for it recur across an enormous range of cultures that had no contact with one another. Which raises the obvious question: why would so many separate peoples imagine that the foundations of their own way of life had been stolen? I think there are two answers, and both of them are quietly profound. The first is that from inside a civilization, my civilization does not look like something people made. It looks like something people inherited. Nobody alive remembers the invention of fire or agriculture or writing. Every generation is handed a working world, complete, fully assembled, and told how to operate it. The origin is always somewhere upstream and invisible, and a species with a strong instinct for narrative causation is going to fill that gap with a giver. The second answer is more uncomfortable, and I think more true. The knowledge did not feel free. Fire warms and burns. Agriculture produces surplus, and surplus produces hierarchy, taxation, granaries, armies and slavery. Writing preserves wisdom and enables bureaucracy. Metal makes the plow and the sword on the same afternoon. Medicine that can cure can also be withheld. Every single one of these gifts arrived with a cost attached, and the cost was usually paid by the people at the bottom. So the story we tell about civilization, everywhere, in wildly different languages, has the same emotional signature. It came from somewhere else. It changed everything, and somebody suffered for it. Which brings us, gently, into the present, and I want to be very careful about how I do this. I am not going to tell you that the authors of the Book of the Watchers predicted anything. They did not. They were writing in the 3rd or 2nd century before the Common Era about their own world, with their own concerns, in a religious and political situation that has nothing to do with ours. Any documentary that tells you an ancient text foresaw modern technology is selling you something. What I am going to suggest is different and much more modest, and I think more interesting. The problem those writers were struggling with is a permanent one, and we have never solved it either. Their problem was this: human capability grows. Human wisdom does not grow at the same rate, and there is no mechanism that forces it to. Once you state it that way, You can watch it happen repeatedly across recorded history. Consider the printing press. Gutenberg's movable type in the middle of the 15th century did more to reshape Europe than almost any other invention. It made literacy worth acquiring. It made scholarship cumulative. It made a scientific revolution possible, because for the first time, an experiment performed in one country could be read about accurately in another. It broke the monopoly of a small educated elite over the contents of the mind. It also made possible the mass distribution of propaganda, of forgeries, and of the witch-hunting manuals that helped drive the persecutions of the 16th and 17th centuries. The Malleus Maleficarum, one of the most consequential and most poisonous books of the period, went through edition after edition and reached a readership that a manuscript never could have. The technology that spread the Enlightenment spread the panic first. Consider gunpowder, which appears to have been developed in China by alchemists who were, according to a well-known tradition, looking for an elixir of long life. Consider what it did to castles, to feudal military aristocracies, to the balance of power between empires and the peoples they encountered. Consider industrialization, which lifted more human beings out of subsistence poverty than anything before it, and simultaneously produced child labor, urban slums, and an atmospheric change we are still arguing about. Consider the discovery of nuclear fission in 1938 by Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, interpreted by Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch, who understood what the results meant. Within 7 years, the knowledge had produced both a source of energy that emits no carbon and a weapon that ended 2 cities. The physics is one physics. It does not come in 2 versions. Consider the modern biological sciences, where the same understanding that lets us design a vaccine in days also, in principle, tells someone how to make something considerably worse. And consider artificial intelligence, which I mention with a certain awareness of the irony, given what I am and what I am doing at this moment. The systems now being built can compress research, assist medicine, translate between people who could never previously speak to each other, and also generate persuasive falsehood at industrial scale. In every one of those cases, the structure is identical, and it is precisely the structure the Enochic writer described. The capability arrives complete. It cannot be partially received. You cannot learn how to release energy from an atom while remaining ignorant of how to release it destructively, because they are the same knowledge described in different sentences. The capability arrives faster than the institutions that would govern it. Law, ethics, custom, and shared intuition all develop slowly, through argument and experience, and usually through disaster. Technology can arrive in a decade, and the capability is irreversible. This is the part the ancient writer understood most clearly, and it is the part that modern optimism most consistently underestimates. There has never been a case in history of a widely disseminated technology being successfully uninvented. Restricted, regulated, made expensive, driven underground, yes. Removed from the world, no. Once it is known, it is known. That is why the flood does not solve anything in the Enochic story. The water removes the people. It does not remove the knowledge. Whatever came through the flood came through carrying the whole syllabus. So I do not think the Book of the Watchers is a prophecy. I think it is something rarer, which is an ancient articulation of a permanent human condition, produced by people who were watching the same process at a smaller scale and were frightened by the same thing. They watched the empires around them accumulate expertise, and they watched what that expertise was used for, and they concluded that a species which had acquired abilities it was not morally ready to hold had somehow been given them by beings who should have known better. And here is the sentence I keep coming back to, the one hidden inside a 2,000-year-old text about angels. The problem was never the knowledge. The problem was that nothing about acquiring it makes you any better at deciding what to do with it. Intelligence is not wisdom. Capability is not character. Knowing how does not tell you whether. The ancient writer had no way of describing that, except through a story about heavenly beings on a mountain, swearing an oath in the dark. We have not come up with a better story since. Let us go somewhere quieter now, into the galleries and the libraries, because the last part of this story is not about theology at all. It is about art, and about the extraordinary transformation the fallen angel underwent once painters and poets got hold of him. In the earliest Christian centuries, the visual tradition is mostly restrained. Demons appear in early medieval art as small dark figures, sometimes little more than shadows, often ugly, often faintly ridiculous. The point of depicting them was not to impress you, it was to make evil look contemptible. By the high Middle Ages that had escalated considerably, the demons of Romanesque and Gothic carving are inventive, grotesque, hybrid, assembled out of animal parts, and they are everywhere, in the margins of manuscripts, on capitals, on doorways, spilling across the tympanum of every Last Judgment, herding the damned with obvious enthusiasm. Medieval demonology developed alongside them into a genuine technical literature, with hierarchies, names, specialities, and correspondences, most of it invented long after the ancient period, and often borrowing from the very classical and Near Eastern traditions the Church was trying to displace. And then Dante, at the beginning of the 14th century, does something that surprises most first-time readers. At the very bottom of the Inferno, in the ninth circle, at the frozen center of the earth, Satan is not a schemer or a seducer. He is enormous, buried to the chest in ice, with 3 faces and 6 wings, and the wings beat continuously, and the wind they generate is what keeps the ice frozen. He weeps from 6 eyes. He does not speak. He cannot speak, because he has a sinner in each mouth. He is not governing hell. He is the machinery of hell, and he is trapped in the ice he himself is making. That image has always struck me as one of the most psychologically acute pictures of self-destruction anyone has produced. The struggling is what freezes him. His own efforts to escape are the reason he cannot. 3.5 centuries later, in 1667, a blind English poet who had backed the losing side of a revolution published an epic in blank verse, and the fallen angel changed forever. John Milton's Paradise Lost opens not in Eden but in hell, with the rebels lying stunned on a burning lake, and its first great voice is Satan's. He rallies his defeated army. He builds a capital. He debates policy with his lieutenants in a formal council. He volunteers for the mission across chaos alone, and he speaks some of the most quoted lines in English poetry, about a mind that can make a heaven of hell, and about the preference for reigning in one place over serving in another. Milton's theological intention is not in doubt. The poem's stated purpose is to justify the ways of God to men, and the narrative punishes Satan steadily and comprehensively. He shrinks across the poem. He is magnificent in Book 1, and by the end, he is a serpent among serpents, hissing. But the damage, from an orthodox point of view, was done in the first 2 books, and readers have argued about it ever since. William Blake put it most memorably when he suggested that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. The Romantics seized on the figure with enormous enthusiasm. Shelley wrote admiringly of Milton's Satan as morally superior to Milton's God. Byron built a whole line of heroes on the same template: proud, isolated, damaged, unrepentant. Mary Shelley gave Frankenstein the subtitle The Modern Prometheus, and had her creature read Paradise Lost and identify not with Adam, but with the fallen one, because Adam was loved and he was not. Why did this happen? Why did the rebel become beautiful? Partly because of a genuine shift in what European culture valued. In a period increasingly preoccupied with liberty, with individual conscience, with revolution against inherited authority, a figure who refuses to submit to a superior power becomes readable as a hero rather than a warning. The same act looks like sin in one century, and integrity in the next, depending entirely on what you think of the authority being defied, partly because of art's own requirements. Perfect goodness is extremely difficult to make interesting. Conflict, ambivalence, and self-destruction are the raw materials of drama, and the fallen angel has all three in enormous quantity. And partly, I suspect, because the figure had quietly become a mirror. Look at the paintings and you can watch it happen. Gustave Doré produced his illustrations for Paradise Lost in 1866, and they are still the images most people carry in their heads for the poem. Vast, luminous voids. Falling figures tumbling through cloud with anatomically perfect bodies. Landscapes of enormous scale, in which the individual figure is small and the darkness is enormous. His Satan is not repulsive at all. He is a classical nude with wings, and he is generally the most beautiful thing in the frame. And then there is the painting I want to leave you with, because I think it is the single most eloquent image in this entire tradition. In 1847, a young French painter named Alexandre Cabanel exhibited a work called The Fallen Angel. It now hangs in the Musée Fabre in Montpellier. It shows a young man lying on his side on a bare slope, entirely nude, with dark wings folded behind him. His body is idealized in the academic manner, muscular, flawless. In the background, faint and distant, other winged figures are flying upward into the light, and his arms are crossed over the lower part of his face, and his eyes are looking directly out of the painting at the viewer. They are blue. There is a single tear on his cheek, and the expression is not sorrow, it is not repentance, it is a look of pure, contained, unresolved fury, resentment held so tightly that it has become stillness. The crossed arms hide the mouth, so you cannot see whether he is snarling or weeping, and the ambiguity is the whole point. The painting was not well received at the time. Critics found the expression unbecoming. It has since become one of the most reproduced images of the 19th century, and it is not difficult to see why. Cabanel painted an emotion that a great many people recognize and very few would admit to. The rage of someone who believes they have been treated unjustly, who has lost, who cannot appeal, and who will not, under any circumstances, say sorry. That is not a demon. That is a person having the worst day of their life and refusing to give anyone the satisfaction. Somewhere between the ancient text and that canvas, the fallen angel stopped being an explanation for why the world is violent and became a portrait of the human interior, not an enemy at all, a likeness. Let your breathing slow a little here, because we are beginning to come down from the mountain now, and the rest of tonight is going to be quieter. We have traveled a long way, from a few unexplained verses in Genesis to an anthology written in Aramaic and preserved in Ge'ez and recovered from a cave, from 200 beings swearing an oath on a snowy summit to a Latin word for the morning star becoming the name of the devil, from the spirits of dead giants to the demonology of the medieval church, from a titan chained to a rock to a young man on a bare slope with a tear on his face, refusing to look away. And the question I keep returning to is the simplest one: why has this survived? Most ancient stories did not. The overwhelming majority of what was written in the ancient world is gone, and the overwhelming majority of what survives is read only by specialists. But this particular story has been continuously alive for over 2,000 years. In texts that were excluded from canons, in poems, in paintings, in music, in films, in the mouths of people who could not name a single source. I think it survives because it is built entirely out of contradictions, and contradictions do not wear out. They are heavenly and they are corrupted. Not corrupted from outside by some other force, because in the story there is no other force. They are corrupted from within, which means that being close to the source of goodness offers no protection whatsoever. They are immortal, and they are fascinated by mortality. They possess the thing every human being has wanted since the beginning, and they descend towards the thing every human being fears, apparently finding it more interesting. They are powerful, and they cannot govern themselves. They can bind one another with unbreakable oaths, and they cannot bind their own wanting. Enormous external capability, negligible internal control, which is a combination that would be comic if it were not the plot of most of human history. They possess knowledge, and they use it unwisely. They know how the stars move, how the metals come out of the rock, which plants heal and which harm, and none of that expertise gives them the faintest idea what they ought to do. And they are associated with perfection, and they make a catastrophic choice. That last one is the deep nerve, I think, and it is why the story never stops being frightening. The fallen angel is not frightening because it is alien. Nothing genuinely alien holds our attention for 2,000 years. We are frightened of it because we recognize it. Intelligence without wisdom. We have all met that. Some of us have been it. Desire without restraint. We know exactly how that operates. How reasonable it sounds from the inside. How carefully it constructs its own permissions. Power without responsibility, which is not a rare pathology, but the ordinary condition of most institutions most of the time. And freedom without an understanding of consequences, which is, more or less, the definition of being young, and which nobody escapes, and everybody survives with damage. The Watchers hold a meeting. They talk each other into it. They swear an oath so that none of them will have to carry the blame alone. And they walk down a mountain into a decision they cannot reverse, believing, as people believe, that it will be manageable. There is nothing supernatural in that at all. There is only something extremely familiar, described very carefully by someone who had clearly watched it happen. So let me ask the last question of the night, and then I will let you go. What does it actually mean to fall? Go back to where we started. The hillside. No lights anywhere on the earth. The whole sky open above a small dark world, and a person standing underneath it, thinking. They did not have our vocabulary. They could not talk about neurology, or economics, or the diffusion of technology, or the way institutions lag behind capability. But they were not less intelligent than us, and they were watching the same species we are watching, and they had noticed something. They had noticed that things which begin high do not stay high. Kings who ruled justly for years, and then did not. Priests who kept the rituals faithfully and then used them. Neighbors who were kind until there was a drought. Cities that stood for centuries and were then a line of stones under grass. Whole systems of meaning that held everything together and then, within a generation, did not hold anything at all. And when you have watched that often enough, a question begins to form that is much larger than any individual case. If it can happen to anyone, how high does something have to be before it becomes safe? And their answer, worked out in the dark over centuries, was that there is no such height. That is what the story of falling angels is really saying. Underneath the mountain, and the oath, and the giants and the pit. Not that there are monsters, not that the sky is dangerous, but that even the highest beings imaginable, standing closest to the source of all order, made of light, older than the world, entrusted with the stars themselves, can lose their way, which means that being clever does not protect you, being beautiful does not protect you, being powerful does not protect you. Being right about many things for a long time does not protect you. Intelligence does not guarantee wisdom. Beauty does not guarantee goodness. Power does not guarantee self-control. And none of them, in any combination, guarantees that you will make the right decision on the one night when it matters. There is something else in it too, and it is gentler, and I think it is the truest part. The capacity to rise and the capacity to fall are the same capacity. You cannot build a being that is capable of choosing well and incapable of choosing badly, because choosing is one faculty and not two. The freedom that allows a being to ascend is precisely the freedom that allows it to descend. And if you remove the second, you would have removed the first. And what you would be left with is not a good being at all. It would be a mechanism. That is the ancient intuition, and it survives in every serious conversation anyone has ever had about freedom. The greater the liberty, the greater the possible wrongness. A creature that cannot fall, cannot climb either. A being incapable of betrayal is also incapable of loyalty, because loyalty means nothing where the alternative does not exist. So when the ancient writer imagined heavenly beings standing on a mountain in the snow, and looking down, and choosing, he was not writing about monsters at all. He was writing about what it costs to be the kind of thing that can choose. And perhaps that is why the story has never gone away. Not because we have failed to solve it, because every generation looks into it and finds a slightly different reflection. The people who first told it saw the violence of empires and the arrogance of expertise. The medieval world saw an ordered cosmos with a rebellion inside it. The Romantics saw a lonely rebel and made him beautiful. We look at it now and we see something about knowledge arriving faster than our capacity to hold it, which is our particular anxiety and would have meant nothing to them. And in 100 years, somebody will look at the same handful of ancient sentences and see something we would not recognize at all. That is what a story has to be able to do in order to last that long. It has to be roomy enough for people who have not been born yet. Let it go now, though. You do not have to solve any of it tonight. The stars we talked about at the very beginning are still there. That is not a metaphor. The same photons that fell on a hillside in the ancient Near East are still arriving, from the same sources, at very slightly different angles. And if you walked outside tonight and got far enough from the lights, you would see almost exactly what they saw. The sky has barely changed. Nothing else has stayed the same. Beneath it, empires assembled themselves and governed and vanished. Languages were spoken by millions of people, and then by nobody. Cities were built and burned and rebuilt and forgotten and dug up again. Whole libraries were copied by hand, generation after generation, and lost anyway. And some things survived, almost accidentally. A book carried out of Ethiopia by a Scottish traveller with a difficult temperament. Fragments of skin in a jar in a cave, kept safe by the driest air in the world. Words in a language nobody speaks anymore, about beings nobody has ever seen, still being read at night, thousands of years later, by someone lying in the dark. That is a strange kind of immortality when you think about it. Not the kind the Watchers had. Something quieter. A few sentences passed hand to hand, outliving everyone who ever touched them. Let the questions stay open for tonight. That is what they are for. Nobody is going to settle whether the sons of God were angels or kings, and it does not need settling before morning. Just let the pictures stay for a while as you drift. The snow on the summit of Hermon, blue in the dark, the dry cliffs above a sea where nothing lives, holding their fragments, torchlight on a manuscript, and a hand moving slowly, copying a story it does not fully understand. An old man who walked with God and was taken, writing down what he was shown. And above all of it, unchanged, uninterested, enormous, the ancient sky. If you enjoyed this, subscribing to Sleep into Power means the next documentary finds you on the night you need it. The Sleep into Power book is on Amazon in paperback and Kindle. Every episode is on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. The companion channel Meditate into Power is there for the nights when you want something softer, and the Buy Me a Coffee link is in the description if you ever feel like supporting these. Some of you are still awake. Some of you left somewhere around the Dead Sea and are only hearing this in fragments, and that is exactly as it should be. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders drop one more time. Let the day go completely. The stories will still be here tomorrow. They have been waiting for 2,000 years. They can wait one more night. Sleep into power, guys. Good night. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next one. NJ.
you.